This video is brought to you with the support of TrueFire. Learn, practice, and play with TrueFire. Hi, this is Keith Williams. Welcome to 5 Watt World, where it's going to help you get the most music from the least gear. My earliest memory of Paul McCartney is as a guitarist, not as a bassist. A film clip of Paul sitting alone in a recording studio playing his right-handed Martin D28 upside down, all by himself, tapping his feet and playing Blackbird. It would be a half dozen years before I'd be sitting with my own acoustic trying to play that required Blackbird, a piece all young guitarists were expected to be able to play in the 1970s of my youth. And I think it's great that I remember Paul as a guitarist first and a bassist second, as that's what he was. So if you want to know more about the guitars and basses that he used with the Beatles, then stay tuned, because this is the 5 Watt World short history of the guitars of Paul McCartney. If you enjoy our videos, make sure to subscribe, or grab a t-shirt, hoodie, or a Stomp preset pack to support what we do. And become a bigger part of 5 Watt World, sign up for the Friends of 5 Watt on Patreon. There's a friend level to suit any budget. The links are in the description. Paul McCartney was born 18 June 1942 in the Walton area of Liverpool, England. Both his parents were of Irish descent, and according to his biographer Peter Ames Carlin, they came from, quote, the lowest rungs of the working class, end quote. In 1954, he met George Harrison while riding a bus from his suburban home in Speke. Paul said he tended to talk down to George, who was a year younger than him. Famously, McCartney went to see Lennon and the Quarrymen at a church fete in the summer of '57. A mutual friend introduced them and leaned on Lennon to consider adding McCartney to the band. McCartney traded his trumpet for a Zenith Model 17 acoustic, an archtop non-cutaway with F-holes. By '58, George Harrison had joined the Quarrymen, and they'd gone electric, buying little amps and adding pickups to their acoustic guitars. By that December, Lennon and McCartney had begun writing songs together, including Love Me Do, Hello Little Girl, and When I'm 64. Tunes that would later become Beatles songs. In the summer of '59, the Casbah Coffee Club opened, and through a series of introductions, the boys were playing every Saturday there from the summer through October. The money from the regular gigs would lead Lennon and Harrison to buy Hofner Club 40 guitars. McCartney continued on with his electrified Zenith. Going into 1960, Lennon convinced a friend from art college to take some money he'd had from selling a painting, and instead of using the money to further his career, Stu Sutcliffe was convinced to use the money to buy a Hofner 500/5 bass guitar and join the band. The scene in Liverpool at the time was heating up, and Larry Parnes, a famous British manager, was going to hold some auditions to form a backing band for somebody on his roster. The boys talked their way onto the audition list under the name the Silver Beatles. Lennon playing his Hofner Club 40, Harrison by then playing his Futurama, McCartney on his Zenith archtop, and Sutcliffe on the new Hofner bass. They didn't get the first prize, but they were hired to back another singer in Parnes' lineup, Johnny Gentle, for a 7-date tour of Scotland. With Tommy Moore as their drummer, the Silver Beatles set out for their first real professional set of shows. In June, after McCartney's 18th birthday, he decided it was time for a new guitar. He retired his Zenith, which he still owns, and bought a Rosetti Solid 7 6-string electric on time at Hesse's Music in Liverpool. It was a semi-hollow body without F-holes, 3 on-a-side tuners, rosewood fingerboard, and a trapeze tailpiece that also functioned as a bridge. The Solid 7 was produced for the UK market by the Eggman Company in the Netherlands. It cost McCartney £21, a relatively inexpensive guitar at the time. During that summer, Alan Williams was functioning as the band's booking manager, and he developed a relationship with a club owner who had 2 clubs in Hamburg, Germany, the Kaiserkeller and the Indra. He offered the Beatles some work there, but the catch was they had to have a drummer. They'd gone through 2 drummers already, so they headed back to the Casbah Club to scout, and there they found Pete Best. Best was the son of the club owner and was there playing drums with his band, the Blackjacks. The club was hopping, and they were impressed with both Pete's playing, but also his brand new Premier kit, which he'd received as a Christmas gift. After an audition for Alan Williams at the Wyvern Club in August, Best was in the band, and within a few days everything was packed in Williams' van, and they were off to Germany. August 17, 1960, saw them start their run at the Indra Club in Hamburg. Lennon on his Club 40, Harrison then with his Futurama, Best on the Premier 3-piece kit, Sutcliffe on his Hofner, and McCartney on his Rosetti. Near the end of 1960, Lennon would famously buy his Rickenbacker 325, and McCartney borrowed Lennon's Club 40 briefly before Lennon sold it. Going into 1961, the Beatles had a lot of gigs booked, but they had a problem in that Stu Sutcliffe had left the band to go back to art school, staying on in Hamburg. McCartney had had to fill in on bass when Stu missed a gig, learning to play the tunes upside down on the right-handed bass. Now the Beatles had to choose a bass player, and no one wanted the job. Paul had always been something of a multi-instrumentalist in the group, so the role fell to him. Now he just had to find a bass. McCartney had just finished paying off his Rosetti and wasn't anxious to get back into debt buying a new bass. So he borrowed a few bass strings from a piano because actual bass strings were so expensive. McCartney swapped out the pickup on the Rosetti to a Hofner 503 pickup near the bridge. In this form, he used the Rosetti as a makeshift bass through the spring to 61 in and around Liverpool. After dealing with a lot of red tape left from the last trip to Hamburg, the Beatles found themselves back there and on April 1st started a residency at the Top 10 Club performing with Tony Sheridan. Sutcliffe came back as the bass player at the early gigs at the Top 10. Due to using the heavier strings on the Rosetti, it had started to come apart, so at first McCartney played piano. But this lineup lasted for a very short time as Sutcliffe made it clear that he didn't want to stay with the band. So now they had to find a bass for McCartney. They'd walked past a Hofner hanging in a window, so they went over there. Paul liked the light weight, and the bass only cost about 30 pounds. As they were making regular money, he bought it. It was on the second floor of the Steinway shop that Paul bought the German-made 500/1 bass. I made an entire short history video on the Hofner Beatle bass, so I won't retell it all here. The original violin-shaped Hofner had a hollow body, 2 pickups, one near the neck and the other sort of in the center, and they were designed to sound like an upright bass. This would be Paul's main bass until the big success of the Beatles in 1963. As a footnote, that original 61 was stolen in 72. In 2023, Hofner launched a webpage dubbed The Lost Bass Project, making a worldwide appeal to find this iconic instrument. It was long believed that the bass had disappeared during the filming of Get Back in 69, but Paul said it was actually stolen from the back of a van in 72, long after the Beatles had split and Paul had started his band Wings. Given the publicity of the search, someone had come forward. The bass had been tucked away in an apartment above a pub and it stayed there for 51 years. Paul had paid approximately 30 pounds for the bass when purchased in 61. It's been speculated that the recovered bass is now worth as much as 10 million pounds. The new gigs included playing in many new venues, the Aintree Institute, the Casanova Club, and most importantly of all, the Cavern. The Cavern Club in central Liverpool was a series of cellars below a warehouse and had opened in 1957 as a jazz-only venue. But by March of 1961, they'd gone rock and roll, and the Beatles performed at the Cavern for the first time, and then again in March. The Cavern became their home base, and they would play over 300 nights there over the next 2 years. That summer, when George was back home in Liverpool, he was able to buy his 57 Gretsch Duojet. So when the band was back at the Cavern Club, McCartney was now on his Hofner violin bass, Harrison on his newly acquired Gretsch, and John on his trusty 325. Near the end of 61, Brian Epstein would sign on as the Beatles' manager. Epstein's day job was working at NEMS, Northern England's largest record distributor, so he focused on using his record company contact to get the boys a recording contract. The big news from these efforts was booking a recording date at Decca Studios in London on January 1st, 1962. The A&R rep for Decca met the boys at the studio at 10 a.m. His first reaction was that the boys' gear was not suitable for recording. His complaints about the condition of the gear would strike home, and Epstein was very embarrassed. Given his lack of managing experience, he didn't know how important good equipment was to the professional group. They recorded 15 songs, and Smith hurried them out saying that he'd be in touch. We know now, famously, Decca turned down the Beatles based on that first recording and audition date. Undeterred, Epstein used the recordings to shop to other labels around London and eventually was introduced to George Martin. The Beatles would head to EMI's Abbey Road studios on June 6th to record some tunes for Martin to assess. Again, the poor state of the band's gear proved to be a problem, and the studio engineers did their best to deal with the hum and noise. Epstein left the sessions knowing 2 things, that the band needed new and better gear, and that they needed to upgrade their drummer. The rigorous schedule led to Best being too ill for a particular gig, and they had to find a substitute for the night. Ringo Starr was the drummer in Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, and as the Hurricanes weren't booked, he filled in for Best. That August, the Beatles would ask Ringo to join the band. Martin called them back for more recordings at EMI in early September, where they would record Love Me Do and How Do You Do It. They would head back there on September 11th, where they re-recorded Love Me Do. Their first Beatles single was released on October 5th, 1962, with Love Me Do as the A-side and P.S. I Love You on the B-side. By October, with the single doing well, George Martin decided it was time for a second single and had the boys come in at the end of November to record Please Please Me and Ask Me Why. The second single would be released on January 11th. Going into the year, Epstein booked the boys heavily to promote the records, pushing their way to the top of the charts. As the year began, the Beatles were very busy, but they couldn't imagine what was to come. I reached out to TrueFire to be my sponsor because I've used them for years. I'm currently having fun going through Eric Johnson's Tone, Melody, and Truth. With over 2 million users worldwide, whether you're a beginner, intermediate, or advanced level player, TrueFire has lessons to enhance and inspire your playing. Get 35% off courses using the promo code 5watt35, or like I do, sign up for the All Access Pass to use the entire TrueFire catalog. I really like TrueFire, and I think if you give them a shot, you'll like them too. Sign up using the link in the description to support 5Watt World and get some great lessons at the same time. I'd like to thank TrueFire for their support in making this video. By March, the first full-length album, Please Please Me, was released, and the boys had their endorsement with Vox providing a pair of black AC-30s and working on a bass rig for Paul. Vox was featuring the Beatles in their ad campaigns on the growing momentum of the band. Heading into the year, Paul's amp rig evolved, but he was still playing his original 61 Hofner. Paul had ordered another Hofner bass to use as a spare. This new 63 would become his main instrument, and the 61 would become the backup. Along with Lennon's Rick 325 and Harrison's newly acquired Gretsch Country Gentleman that year, Paul's 63 Hofner is the instrument most recognizably associated with the Beatles. So much so, it's become known simply as the Beatle bass. This bass had two staple-style pickups mounted farther apart in contrast to the 61, where both pickups are near to the neck in middle positions. McCartney would use the 63 for most of their concerts and television appearances for the rest of the time that the band was together, and he's even used it on the road in these later years. In October, they were back in the studio recording I Want to Hold Your Hand, backed with This Boy. The single for I Want to Hold Your Hand could come out in late December in the States, and by January it had reached number 1 on the US charts. Epstein capitalized on this as the boys had said that they wouldn't dare go to the States without first having a hit there. The Beatles landed in New York on February 7th to a crowd, and on February 8th, the group began camera rehearsals for their appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, which would air on February 9th. Rose Morris, the UK importer of Rickenbacker guitars, encouraged the leadership at Rickenbacker to try to meet with the Beatles while they were in the States. I outlined much of this meeting in the video on George Harrison's guitar, so I'll just add in brief here that Rick wanted to get the guys to switch over to their new line of amps, but the guys weren't interested in that. They were interested in the guitars. This meeting would build on the relationship between the Beatles and Rickenbacker and would lead to other guitars for both John and Paul later on. Famously, Francis Hall brought a left-handed 4001 bass to the meeting, but they wanted assurances that Paul would switch over to the bass in concert in exchange for giving it to Paul. At that time, McCartney refused the bass, but Rickenbacker would successfully give it to him in the summer of '65. The Beatles' appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show turned out to be a milestone in television and music history. The audience for that initial February 9th appearance was estimated to be 73 million people. On Ed Sullivan, Lennon played his Rick 325, Harrison his Gretsch Country Gentleman, McCartney that 63 Hofner, and Ringo the black Pearl Ludwig kit with Beatles logo bass drum head. These instruments would be the ones that were burned into the memories of all that saw the broadcast. On the afternoon before the show, they had taped a live performance of Twist and Shout, Please Please Me, and I Want to Hold Your Hand that would be aired on February 23rd. During '64, Epstein crafted a deal with Hofner that allowed them to put a hang tag on their guitars that had a picture of McCartney with a quote, "Wishing you every success with this guitar," along with McCartney's signature. In exchange, Epstein was to receive £5 for each instrument sold, and a custom left-handed Hofner was to be built for Paul with gold hardware and a very fancy figured back and sides. The bass was built without a serial number. Despite a formal presentation to McCartney sometime in March or April of '64, McCartney did not leave with the bass. It remained at Selmer, Hofner's UK distributor. But the bass never made it to Paul. Later, the bass seemed to surface and was even offered for auction in '97 by Bonham's Tokyo. Hearing of this, McCartney made it clear that he'd never owned or used the bass. Many stories revolve around this bass, so I'll leave you to go seek them out if you like a good mystery on the internet. While on tour that year, McCartney left his 61 Hofner with Sound City to have some work done. They arranged to have the body refinished in a sunburst, built a new mounting system for the two pickups, and a new set of taller volume knobs replaced the originals. With this work done, Paul then again carried the 61 on the road as a spare for his 63. In August of '64, Paul would acquire his Epiphone Texan FT-79N flat-top acoustic. He likely bought it on a shopping trip to Manny's Music in New York to buy a replacement for John's missing Gibson J160E. Epiphone was a long-standing brand that had fallen on hard times, and they'd sold up to Gibson in '57. At that point, they moved production of the guitars from New York to Kalamazoo, Michigan, and Epiphones of that period were made on the line alongside very similar Gibson models. In this way, the Texan is an Epiphone version of a slope-shouldered Gibson J45, mahogany back and sides and neck, and a natural finish top. McCartney would use it for the majority of his later acoustic work, including the recording of Yesterday. The Texan retailed at the time for about $175, or about $1,700 in today's money. Prepping for the Christmas shows at the end of '64, photographs show McCartney and Harrison examining Paul's new right-handed Epiphone Casino so that the left-handed McCartney could use it. I outlined the history of the Casino in this video, but in essence, they were launched in '61 and were based on the fully hollow, thin-line Gibson ES330. McCartney said he was influenced to get his Casino by John Mayall, who played endless classic blues records for him in late-night listening sessions. In a 1997 interview, he said that if he had to choose just one electric guitar to use, it would be his '62 Casino. It wasn't the most expensive Epiphone made in '64, but Paul said that he wanted one with a Bigsby installed, and the Casino was the one in stock that had one. As they had during '64, the Beatles went into '65 with a rigorous schedule planned out. By October of '65, the boys would be in the studio working on Rubber Soul. McCartney was using his left-handed Rickenbacker 4001S almost exclusively on those sessions. Paul commented that it stayed in tune much better than his Hofner, and the maple body gave it a punchier, more upfront sound. McCartney's 4001 was a special model produced for British importer Rose Morris, with many of the features of the higher-end 4001, but with dot inlays on an unbound fretboard, unlike the 4001s in the States. The bass had been presented to Paul before the Hollywood Bowl show in the summer of '65. Though this was a UK-only model, because of McCartney's use of them, they are sought after by collectors. With their huge success, the Beatles decided to start filming recordings of their songs rather than head to TV studios the world over. So that November found them in the Twickenham film studios filming promos for the tunes on Rubber Soul. April '65 saw the boys back in the studio starting the sessions for Revolver. They'd taken delivery of a cream-colored Fender Bassman amp, and Paul was playing his 4001S through that on the session. Despite using the 4001S in the studio, Paul played the songs live on his Hofner on tour that year, carrying his Rick on the road as well. During the sessions, McCartney used his Casino for the guitar parts. August 29, 1966 marked the end of the American tour. It would also end up being the Beatles' final public concert. The constant touring where the music could rarely be heard over the screaming crowd had lost its appeal, and the band decided that it would be easier and more constructive musically to work in the studio. That way people would at least be able to hear their music. It was the end of an era, the end of Beatlemania. '67 saw the Beatles in the studio working on Sgt. Pepper's, and Paul was photographed alternating between his Casino and a Fender Esquire. The right-handed Sunburst Finish 66 Esquire had a rosewood fingerboard on a maple neck. It also had the strap button moved to facilitate the right-handed guitar being played left-handed. The Esquire is a single pickup version of the Fender Telecaster and was first issued in 1950. Sometime between the end of the sessions for Sgt. Pepper's and the All You Need Is Love TV broadcast, the Beatles decided to try a new look for their guitars. Probably most famous is the paint job that Harrison gave to his Stratocaster, naming it Rocky. John had the artist known as The Fool paint his J160E, but decided at the last minute not to use the guitar during the broadcast, opting just to sing. McCartney did a somewhat tamer version on his Rickenbacker 4001S bass that was used during the worldwide satellite broadcast. On August 23rd, the Beatles went to Wales to study transcendental meditation under Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. While there, they learned that Brian Epstein had been found dead. Harrison said at the time that other than make music, they didn't know how to do any of it without Brian. It was a blow that some claim the Beatles never recovered from as a band, that it was really the beginning of the end. The boys went off to India with a group of friends, including Donovan Leitch, Mike Love from the Beach Boys, and Mia Farrow. Before the trip, Paul had been inspired to get a Martin D28 like the one that Lennon had recently acquired. While there, they rested, meditated at the foot of the Himalayas, and wrote songs that would end up on the White Album. McCartney would later record Blackbird on that D28 with only a metronome for accompaniment. After returning, they began recording demos for the White Album. Harrison noted in a later interview that they were all working in different studios, adding that in many ways the Beatles had broken up at the time of Epstein's death, never functioning as a full band again. Of the new Apple Corp., Harrison said, "There were a lot of ideas, but when it came down to it, the only thing we could do successfully was write songs, make records, and be Beatles." As the White Album sessions continue, Paul used a left-handed Fender jazz bass given to them after a meeting with Fender's head of marketing and distribution, Don Randall. His left-handed jazz bass had a sunburst finish, tortoiseshell pickguard, and a rosewood fingerboard with block inlays on a maple neck. It was built in 1966, and all of those features were standard at that time. From the few photographs there are, it seems that he played the bass with both the bridge and pickup covers in place. 69 saw the Beatles still relatively separate and adrift business-wise. Their recording and filming sessions for Get Back have been thoroughly gone over. The news was mostly in new amps and the delivery of Harrison's Rosewood Telly and the use of Harrison with his 57 Les Paul that Clapton had given him the previous year. The sessions that ran from the end of 68 into 69 were capped off with the famous rooftop concert on January 30th, 1969. Having all gone their separate ways after the rooftop concert, George Martin said later that he believed that the Beatles would have broken up at that time. And so he was very surprised when Paul called him to say that they were going to make one more record and asked if Martin would produce it. They booked the studio from July 1st to August 29th. Photographic evidence of those final sessions is very sparse, but we see Lennon playing his stripped Casino, Harrison playing Lucy, his red 57 Les Paul, and Ringo played his 67 Ludwig Hollywood kit that he'd begun experimenting with during the White Album, while McCartney played his now stripped and natural 4001S. Abbey Road was released on September 26, 1969, and that was the end. McCartney would go on to use that bass as his main instrument in his band Wings, which was one of my teenage favorites. Wings Over America was released on December 10, 1976. Wintertime meant I was patching apple crates out in an unheated barn. I could see light coming through between the worn and weathered siding. The wind came out of the north and whistled there. But I had a white plastic AM radio, and the tunes from that record were in heavy rotation that winter. I clearly remember that when Band on the Run would come on, I'd set down my hammer, stack up a couple of apple crates, and sit down and listen until it was over. Then I'd slowly shake my head in appreciation, pick up my hammer and patch another crate with the tune still echoing in my head. If you like this video, check out my videos on the guitars of George Harrison, along with the guitars of Get Back. First, I need to thank John Cordy for his always amazing adaptation of music that we almost recognize on iconic instruments. This video would not have been possible without the exhaustive work of Andy Babiuk in his book, Beatles Gear. It's a must-have for any Beatles and gear history fan. I want to thank everyone that stopped by the online store and picked up a t-shirt, hoodie, hat, or a Stomp preset pack. And in particular, I want to thank the friends of 5 Watt on Patreon. It's the guitar community I've always wanted. You're all 5 Watt World. I just make the videos. If you enjoyed this short history of the guitars of Paul McCartney, then go ahead and hit the like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that too. Thanks for hanging with me until the end. Until next time, I'm Keith Williams. Thanks for being a part of the 5 Watt World.